Today's episode is brought to you by Mazars.
SoundCartel.
Is that light we can see at the end of a very long COVID tunnel? As we inch towards vaccination rates of 70 and 80%, will vaccination mandates become the next challenge for business owners to navigate? From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. As record numbers of people get vaccinated and our two biggest states count the cost of ongoing lockdowns, the question is quickly becoming whether businesses can mandate a no jab, no job policy. The answer is, well, there is no easy answer. Karen Gately of Corporate Dojo says from a legal perspective, it's not entirely clear what you can do. That hasn't stopped some companies testing it out though. As Karen Gately explains to Chris Ashmore, in August, Shepparton-based SPC was the first company in Australia to mandate its employees and on-site visitors to be vaccinated for COVID-19.
For them, my understanding is that they felt that they're an essential service and, in order to keep operating, they need to have certain guarantees that to a certain extent, the ability to guarantee that they can keep working. So, if people don't have their vaccinations, they're not going to be able to do any on-site work, which again is a big decision, but one they obviously believe is necessary.
But legally, is SPC allowed to do this?
That's the big challenge right now for a lot of employers is all the government has done at this point is provide guidelines. So they've released 4-tier system that maps out different levels of employer and what that means for what's likely to be seen as reasonable. So, for example, if you are in the health sector, you're in the front line delivering essential services, that's the most likely space where it's going to be ultimately deemed as a reasonable stance to take or policy to set, all the way through, obviously, to employers where the work is office-bound. So, in other words, the less contact you have with health services, aged care services and the public, then the less likely it's going to be seen as a necessary step to take. The reasonableness of it is really what's going to be tested over time. I think we're going to see some individuals in all sorts of sectors challenging their employers' decisions or policies, and I don't think it's going to be until those things play out that in the courts that we're really going to know how the law sees it and what the laws around it are. So, again, my understanding is that a lot of business groups were resistant to actually having a really clear prescribed approach. They wanted to have more opportunity to consider things for themselves, their own industry, case by case. But it means for a lot of employers, then they really are running the gauntlet with the policy that they put in place and whether or not that's seen as lawful.
Well, it makes it tough for employers, doesn't it, when there is little clarity? Is there something that the government can do to make it clearer and easier for employers to make a decision?
Yeah, I think, again, the tiered system is a starting point, but I think really helping employers with guidelines around how they can navigate that decision-making process. So insight to what is likely to be seen as reasonable or otherwise. So an example might be that if you're starting from a place of thinking about occupational health and safety, how should you go about thinking about that? What's the levels of risk of people being exposed in your environment, but also what is the risk factors in relation to your business's ability to survive and operate and keep doing what it's doing if there is an issue that arises. So, I think if they're not going to be prescriptive about it, then I think they need to invest heavily on guidelines, as I say, and ways in which that employers can be helped down that path of making the best possible decision that they can make.
Well, legalities aside, is it reasonable that a business requires staff to be vaccinated? What do you think?
Yeah, and I think, again, this whole word reasonableness is the key. I think that this is a very new challenge for all of us. I think nobody really knows exactly what the answers are. And for me personally, I think if you are engaged in the type of work. For example, you are working with elderly people, you're working with people who are high risk in terms of their health conditions, then yes, I think there is a stronger argument that it is reasonable that we need to minimise the risks in those environments. We need to uphold our duty of care to our patients or our customers. And I think what also needs to be reasonable is how we roll out those policies. So giving people plenty of notice that this is the path we're going down so that they can contemplate their options, either go and obviously comply or they're going to change career direction. So I think the simple reality is for some professions, it's going to be get on board or get off the bus. It'll be that simple. And I think there's, as I've already said, some reasonableness in that kind of decision because of our duties. When you then reflect on an employer where there isn't that public exposure or exposure to groups of people who are at risk, then it's a harder decision to make because, obviously human beings have their own preferences and have their own beliefs. So to restrict their opportunity to have a job because of the need to be vaccinated is a tougher call to make, in my opinion.
If you want a business advisor that walks with you and not just talks with you, then Mazars is the right fit for your business. To find out more, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.
Well, if a business owner is thinking about mandating vaccines for their workers or asking their staff to be vaccinated, what should they consider?
Yeah, I think it does start again with what are you having to deliver as a business? So what are your operational requirements? What are the risks? So, for example, that might be a risk around, as I've already pointed out, people that we are responsible for and their wellbeing, but it also could be public exposure and risks. And think through that landscape. What's your context within which you are operating? And, obviously your ability to keep your doors open, to keep your customers safe, to keep your staff safe, and what are the various factors around that. If it's not, in your mind, an easy or clear decision to make, then I would tap into the views of other people, whether that be within your business or absolutely within your industry. I think certain industry groups should be working together to resolve some of these challenges. If industry participants are bringing their minds together, creating policies together, making it consistent across the industry, again, it's entirely more likely to be effectively applied. Then I think you need to be educating people in your teams, again, to the extent that you can, because it's an unknown area. But, for example, helping people to understand the real risks around vaccinations. So we've seen a lot of misinformation. I know for myself, when I read a report by the Australian Bureau of Statistics around the likelihood of having an issue with a vaccination, it did fundamentally shift my level of fear and concern around it. I read somewhere that I was more likely to be struck by lightning than to get a blood clot from AstraZeneca. I read that it was a higher risk for women, for example, with a contraceptive pill, especially for a woman who smokes and takes a contraceptive pill relative to, again, a vaccination. So, again, you're not going to change everyone's views or overcome everybody's fears, but you can go some way toward giving them useful information, validated fact-based information to make sure that, again, people are well informed. And then again, as I said earlier, just taking the time to take people on a journey to suddenly turn around and say, okay, this is a decision we've made and we're making that effective next week is a little bit harsh. So obviously we all want to get on with protecting ourselves and one another, but give people a heads up around the decisions that you're making and the directions that you're heading in so that, again, they have opportunity to make their own calls around that.
Well, most employees, most people are quite okay with being vaccinated. They understand the importance of it, and not only for the business but for the country to get out of lockdown. But for those employees that may refuse to be vaccinated, is there anything you can do?
Sorry to sound like I'm repeating myself, but it kind of depends, I think that the risk that's going to be run in this space is around discrimination, and we're yet to see that play out. If I put a case that I am being discriminated against because of my personal choices around my health and wellbeing, then how well that stands up, I think, is really going to come down to the employer's circumstances, and what the counter argument around reasonableness is. because inherently I think all of us want to respect one another's rights to make our own choices and to certainly have rights around our own bodies and what we choose to put in them or not. But at the same time, we all belong to broader communities and we're part of a bigger world where it's not just about us. So I think clearly you can't force someone to be vaccinated. You can only take away their job or restrict their movements. So, for example, some employers will say, if you're not vaccinated, you can't come back on site, but that may not preclude them from doing remote working ongoing, which again is going to be a tricky one for employers to kind of navigate, because if you are somebody who wants to do remote working moving forward, and one way to assure you yourself of making that happen is just not get a vaccination, or at least say you haven't been vaccinated. So some people might even take advantage of that. So again, you can only inspire, you can only hope to educate, you can only encourage, and then you can only put policies in place that will then cause people to make their own choices around that.
That was Corporate Dojo CEO Karen Gately. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at SoundCartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow @BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast. SoundCartel. This episode was brought to you by Mazars. To find out more, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.